On August 26, 1921, Frank A. Seiberling walked out of the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company headquarters in Akron, Ohio for the last time as president. He was 62 years old. He'd founded the company 23 years earlier in a rented factory with 13 employees and a $3,500 loan. He'd built it into the world's largest tire manufacturer. 16,000 employees, plants across America and overseas, revenue in the hundreds of millions. And now, bankers from Dillon, Read and Company had forced him out. A proxy fight, a hostile refinancing. The board voted, Frank lost. He went home to Stan Hywet Hall, the 65-room Tudor Revival manor he'd completed just 6 years earlier, 64,500 square feet on 70 acres, one of the largest private residences in America, built when Goodyear was ascending, when Frank was one of the most powerful industrialists in the country. Above the main entrance, carved into stone, was the family motto, Non Nobis Solum, not for us alone. Frank had chosen that motto deliberately in 1915. It represented his belief that wealth should serve the community, that what he built at Goodyear and at Stan Hywet wasn't just for his family, but for Akron, for his employees, for society. In 1921, standing in that entrance hall after losing his company, the motto must have felt like mockery. Because at that moment, Frank had nothing. No company, no income, no savings. He'd reinvested everything into Goodyear stock that was now worthless to him. "I went out in the streets without a dollar to my name," he later said. The palace remained, 70 acres, 65 rooms, English gardens, a lagoon, a conservatory, date lodge, servants' quarters, all of it still standing. But the empire that paid for it was gone. Stan Hywet Hall stands today as one of America's finest examples of Tudor Revival architecture. It's open to the public as a museum and garden estate. Over 150,000 visitors tour it annually. They walk through the Great Hall with its massive fireplace and oak beams. They admire the music room's carved oak paneling. They photograph the gardens designed by Warren Manning. They see beauty, craftsmanship, American industrial wealth at its peak. What they don't see, Frank built this palace in 1912 to 1915, right before everything collapsed. He lived there 40 years from 1915 to 1955, but only the first 6 as president of Goodyear. The remaining 34 years were spent either rebuilding a new company or, in old age, watching his children struggle to maintain the estate. 2 years after Frank died in 1955, his children donated Stan Hywet to a non-profit foundation. They couldn't afford to keep it. The operating costs were too high. The fortune that built it had been divided and diminished. The motto above the door, "Not for us alone," turned out to be prophetic. Stan Hywet survived only by becoming public property, exactly as the motto suggested it should. The question isn't why Stan Hywet exists. The question is what it cost the man who built it, and whether the palace he completed at the peak of his power became a monument to everything he lost. If you enjoy explorations of grand historical properties and the complex stories behind them, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which property you'd like me to explore next. Your support makes these deep dives possible, and I read every comment. Thank you for being here. Now, let's begin with a man who built a tire empire from a $3,500 loan, constructed a palace to celebrate his success, and then lost everything within 6 years, only to discover that survival sometimes requires becoming something other than what you built.
Frank Augustus Seiberling was born on October 6, 1859, in western Star, Ohio, a tiny village that doesn't exist anymore. His father, John F. Seiberling, was an inventor and businessman. He manufactured farm equipment, reapers and mowers, with moderate success. The family was comfortable, but not wealthy. Respectable, middle-class German immigrants trying to build something in America. Frank grew up watching his father run a business. He learned early that manufacturing required capital, innovation, good timing, and a tolerance for risk, all lessons he'd use later. He attended Heidelberg College in Tiffin, Ohio, but didn't graduate. Instead, he went to work for his father's company in 1879 at age 20. He learned the machinery business from the ground up: sales, production, management, finance. In 1887, his father's company failed. Economic depression, bad debt, competitors with better products. The business collapsed. The family lost nearly everything. Frank was 28. The failure taught him two things. First, that success is temporary and must be defended constantly. Second, that starting over is possible if you have the will for it. He spent the next decade working in various business ventures. Nothing spectacular. He sold grain. He worked in real estate. He tried manufacturing ventures that mostly failed. By the late 1900s, he was nearly 40 and still hadn't found his opportunity. Then, in 1898, he noticed something. Bicycles were everywhere, and they needed rubber tires. More importantly, a new invention called the automobile was beginning to appear, and it would need tires too. Lots of them. The rubber industry was young. A few companies existed, but the market was wide open. If you could make a better tire, more durable, cheaper, or both, you could build a fortune. Frank borrowed $3,500 from his brother-in-law, Lucius Miles. He rented an abandoned strawboard factory in East Akron, the Goodyear building, named after Charles Goodyear, who'd invented vulcanized rubber. He hired 13 employees. And on August 29, 1898, the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company began operations. The name was strategic. Frank didn't invent vulcanized rubber. Charles Goodyear had done that decades earlier. But the name carried weight. It suggested quality, innovation, legacy. And Charles Goodyear's family didn't object to Frank using the name, so he did. The timing was perfect. Automobile production was accelerating. Henry Ford would introduce the Model T in 1908, creating mass demand for affordable cars and therefore affordable tires. The companies that could supply that demand would grow exponentially. Frank could. Goodyear's early tires were good, durable, reasonably priced, reliable. Orders came in. Revenue grew. Frank reinvested everything into expansion. By 1901, Goodyear employed 300 workers. By 1909, 1,500. By 1916, 15,000. Frank became wealthy. Not just comfortable. Wealthy in the way that changes how you think about everything. Wealthy enough to build a palace. In 1911, Frank and his wife Gertrude purchased 70 acres in northwest Akron. The land was beautiful. Rolling hills, mature trees, views across the Cuyahoga Valley. It was also isolated enough to feel private while remaining close to Goodyear's factories. Frank envisioned something grand, not just a large house, but an estate, gardens, lawns, guest cottages, everything a successful industrialist needed to entertain business associates, host community events, and demonstrate that Akron, often dismissed as a gritty industrial city, could produce culture and beauty alongside rubber tires. He hired architect Charles Schneider of Cleveland to design the manor house. Frank had specific ideas: Tudor Revival style, English country estate aesthetics adapted to Ohio, built to last centuries, and above all, a house that felt like a home, not a museum. The name came from Old English, Stan Hywet, meaning stone quarry. The property had been a quarry before Frank bought it, and he liked the connection to the land's history. Construction began in 1912. It would take 3 years and employ hundreds of workers. The project's scale was enormous. 65 rooms, 64,500 square feet of living space, stone and half-timbered construction.
A great hall rising 3 stories with massive oak beams and a stone fireplace large enough to stand in. 23 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, servants' quarters for a full household staff. But Frank didn't want just a house, he wanted gardens. He hired Warren Manning, a protege of Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed Central Park, to design 70 acres of landscaped grounds. Manning created an English garden, an American garden, a Japanese garden, a birch tree alley, reflecting pools, walking paths, a lagoon with boathouse. Each garden had its own character and purpose, some formal, some naturalistic, all meticulously planned. The total cost ran approximately $3.5 million. In 2024 terms, roughly $100 million. Frank could afford it. By 1913, Goodyear was one of America's fastest-growing companies. The automobile boom was creating insatiable demand for tires. Goodyear's revenue climbed year after year. Frank's personal wealth climbed with it. Stan Hywet was completed in December 1915. The family moved in just before Christmas. Frank, Gertrude, and their 6 children, Penfield, Willard, Frederick, Franklin, Irene, and Virginia. The house was everything Frank had envisioned, grand enough to impress, comfortable enough to feel like home, beautiful enough to showcase what American industrial wealth could create. Above the main entrance, Frank had stonemasons carve the family motto, Non nobis solum, not for us alone. The motto reflected Frank's philosophy. He believed wealth carried responsibility, that successful businessmen owed something to their communities, that Stan Hywet should serve purposes beyond family comfort, hosting community events, supporting local culture, demonstrating civic pride. In 1915, standing in the great hall of his newly completed manor house, Frank had every reason to believe his success was permanent. Goodyear was thriving, his family was healthy. Stan Hywet stood as proof that he'd built something lasting. Within 6 years, everything would collapse.
The numbers clarify what narrative sometimes obscures. Stan Hywet Hall sits on 70 acres in northwest Akron. The manor house itself, 64,500 square feet across 3 floors plus basement, 65 rooms total. The Great Hall, 3 stories high, 21 feet wide, 65 feet long. Oak beams shipped from forests in Indiana. A fireplace 6 feet wide and 8 feet high, built from local sandstone. Walls paneled in oak. Leaded glass windows. Medieval-inspired design meant to evoke English manor houses. The music room, oak paneling carved with intricate designs. A Steinway grand piano. Seating for musical performances and social gatherings. Acoustics designed specifically for chamber music. The dining room seated 24 guests comfortably. A massive oak table. Carved chairs. Tapestries on the walls. Service connection to the basement kitchen via dumbwaiter. The library, thousands of books, many purchased by Frank himself, who was an avid reader. Walnut paneling, a fireplace. Comfortable chairs for reading. Frank's personal retreat. The billiard room, full-size billiard table, card tables, a bar. The masculine space where Frank entertained business associates and played with his sons. 23 bedrooms upstairs, family quarters, guest rooms, children's rooms. Each with period furnishings. Several with private bathrooms, still a luxury in 1915. The basement, kitchens, laundry, storage, servants' dining hall, wine cellar, mechanical rooms. A complete service infrastructure hidden beneath the public rooms. The Gate Lodge, a separate building at the estate entrance, originally for the estate superintendent, later notable as the birthplace of Alcoholics Anonymous in 1935, when Frank's daughter-in-law, Henrietta Seiberling, arranged the first meeting between AA co-founders Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith. The Gardens, 70 acres designed by Warren Manning, the English garden with formal beds and topiaries, the Japanese garden with stone lanterns and maples, the birch tree alley leading to the lagoon, the dell with naturalistic plantings, the breakfast room garden outside the morning room, hundreds of plant species, miles of walking paths. The lagoon, a man-made pond with boathouse and quarried stone edges, used for swimming, boating, and ice skating in winter. Construction details: Indiana limestone for the exterior, half timbering filled with stucco, slate roof tiles, oak and walnut throughout the interior, leaded glass windows throughout, a central heating system, modern for 1915, electric lighting, though gas fixtures remained as backup. Staff required: approximately 25 full-time employees, gardeners, housekeepers, cooks, maids, chauffeurs, maintenance workers, all housed either in the manor's servants' quarters or in separate buildings on the estate. Construction time: 3 years, 1912 to 1915, hundreds of workers, local craftsmen working alongside imported specialists, materials sourced from across America and Europe. Total cost: approximately $3.5 million, roughly $100 million in 2024 terms. Annual operating costs? Difficult to determine precisely, but later estimates from the 1940s suggest approximately $30,000 to $40,000 per year. In today's terms, roughly $600,000 to $800,000 annually, just to maintain a private residence. All of this built between 1912 and 1915, when Goodyear was ascending, when Frank's fortune seemed limitless, when the future looked secure. None of it could protect him from what came next.
World War I was both blessing and curse for Goodyear. The war created enormous demand for rubber products. Military vehicles needed tires. Supply trucks needed tires. Civilian vehicles supporting the war effort needed tires. Goodyear's production ran at full capacity. Revenue soared. By 1916, Goodyear had become the world's largest tire manufacturer. By 1919, the company employed more than 20,000 workers across multiple plants. Frank's personal wealth grew with the company. But the war also created vulnerabilities. Goodyear expanded rapidly to meet wartime demand, taking on debt to finance new factories and equipment. The assumption was that post-war demand would remain high. It didn't. In 1920, the American economy collapsed into recession. The post-war adjustment was brutal. Soldiers returned home, flooding the labor market. Wartime government contracts ended. Consumer spending dropped as people adjusted to peacetime budgets. Demand for automobiles, and therefore tires, plummeted. Goodyear's revenue fell from its wartime peak. The company had massive inventory, warehouses full of tires that weren't selling. It had debt from wartime expansion, and it had fixed costs, factories, equipment, workers that couldn't be easily reduced. By 1921, Goodyear faced a crisis. Sales had fallen to approximately $105 million with a loss of about $5 million. The company needed cash to service its debt and continue operations. Banks grew nervous. Frank had reinvested nearly everything into Goodyear stock. His personal wealth was tied to the company's value. If Goodyear failed, he'd lose everything, including Stan Hywet. The bankers offered a solution. Dillon Read and Company would arrange a refinancing. They'd bring in new capital, restructure the debt, and stabilize the company. But there were conditions. The board needed to be restructured, new directors appointed. Management needed to be professionalized, less family control, more corporate oversight. And Frank would step down as president. He could stay as chairman or in an advisory role, but he would no longer run day-to-day operations. Frank refused. He'd founded Goodyear, built it from 13 employees to 20,000. He wasn't going to stay as a figurehead while bankers and outsiders ran the company he'd created. In August 1921, the board voted. The refinancing went forward. Frank was out as president. He walked out of Goodyear headquarters and never returned in any official capacity. 23 years of building, gone in a board vote. "I went out into the streets without a dollar to my name," he said later. That was exaggeration. He still owned Stan Hywet and had some assets, but in terms of liquid wealth and income, he was essentially broke. Everything had been in Goodyear stock, now controlled by others. He was 62 years old, an age when most successful men consider retirement. Frank had just lost his empire and needed to start over. And he went home to Stan Hywet Hall, the 65-room palace he'd built to celebrate success that no longer existed.
Frank didn't retire. He couldn't afford to, literally and psychologically. Within months of leaving Goodyear, he started a new company, Seiberling Rubber Company, a competitor to the company he'd founded and lost. He borrowed money, found investors willing to bet on his name and experience, rented factory space, hired workers, many of them former Goodyear employees loyal to Frank. The new company would make tires, just like Goodyear, but it would do things Frank's way, without bankers and boards constraining him. It was audacious. Frank was 62, starting from scratch in an industry he'd just been forced out of, competing against the company he'd built. Most people would have seen it as impossible. Frank saw it as necessary. Seiberling Rubber began operations in 1921. The timing was terrible. The recession hadn't ended. But Frank had advantages: his reputation, his knowledge of the industry, his connections. Distributors who'd worked with him at Goodyear gave Seiberling a chance. The company grew, not as fast as Goodyear had in its early years, but steadily. By 1923, Seiberling Rubber was profitable. By 1925, it was one of the major tire manufacturers in America. By 1927, just 6 years after Frank had been forced out of Goodyear, Seiberling Rubber had risen from the 330th largest company in America to the 7th, an extraordinary comeback. Frank had proven that losing everything doesn't mean staying down, that at 62 you can rebuild, that the skills and knowledge that built one empire can build another. But there was a cost. Frank worked relentlessly through his 60s. The stress of starting over, of competing against his own legacy, of proving that his ouster from Goodyear had been a mistake, all of it consumed him. And he lived at Stan Hywet through all of it. The palace built to celebrate his success at Goodyear became the home he occupied while building Seiberling. The estate meant to host victories became the place he returned to each night after battles to survive. The motto above the door, "Not for us alone," must have felt different during those years. Not a statement of philanthropic intent, but a reminder that the house, the gardens, the 70 acres, none of it was really his alone. It all depended on his ability to keep earning, keep building, keep fighting. By 1928, Frank had largely succeeded. Seiberling Rubber was established. He was financially secure again, not at Goodyear levels of wealth, but comfortable. He was 69 years old. He'd spent the previous 7 years rebuilding from zero, and he would spend the remaining 27 years of his life at Stan Hywet, watching as the world he'd known slowly changed around him. The Great Depression hit in 1929, and with it came new challenges. Seiberling Rubber survived, but barely. Demand for tires collapsed as automobile sales plummeted. Workers were laid off, production slowed. The company that had risen so fast in the 1920s stagnated through the 1930s. Frank was in his 70s during the Depression, still working, still involved in the company, but no longer able to drive growth the way he had in his 40s and 50s. Age and stress had taken their toll. Meanwhile, Stan Hywet required constant maintenance and enormous operating costs. The staff had to be reduced, the gardens couldn't be maintained at the same level. Parts of the estate fell into gentler neglect, not abandoned, but no longer pristine. The family adapted. Gertrude managed the household with fewer servants. The children, now adults with families of their own, helped where they could. Stan Hywet became less a showcase for entertaining and more simply a large family home. But something else happened at Stan Hywet during the 1930s that would become historically significant. In 1935, Henrietta Seiberling, wife of Frank's son, John, arranged a meeting between two men struggling with alcoholism. One was Bill Wilson, a New York stockbroker. The other was Dr. Bob Smith, an Akron surgeon. The meeting took place in the Gate Lodge at Stan Hywet on May 12, 1935. Henrietta believed the two men could help each other. They talked for hours about their struggles with alcohol, their failed attempts to quit, their belief that recovery required spiritual transformation. That meeting became the founding moment of Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith became the co-founders of AA. The principles they discussed that day, the 12 steps, the focus on mutual support, the spiritual foundation, all emerged from that conversation. Stan Hywet's Gate Lodge is now recognized as the birthplace of AA. A plaque marks the location. AA members visit from around the world to see where their organization began. Frank and Gertrude likely had no idea how historically significant that meeting would become. To them, it was just Henrietta trying to help two people. But in retrospect, it's the most lasting legacy connected to Stan Hywet. Not the architecture or gardens, but the fact that a movement that has helped millions of people began in the Gate Lodge. Non nobis solum, not for us alone. The motto proved true in ways Frank hadn't anticipated when he carved it above the door. Frank's later years were complicated. He remained involved with Seiberling Rubber into his 80s, though with diminishing active role. The company continued operating, but it never matched Goodyear's scale or success. It remained a mid-tier tire manufacturer, successful enough to survive, but not dominant. In 1964, 9 years after Frank's death, Seiberling Rubber would be sold to Firestone Tire and Rubber Company. The Seiberling brand continued for a while under Firestone ownership, but eventually disappeared. The company Frank built after losing Goodyear didn't outlast him by much. At Stan Hywet, Frank and Gertrude aged together. They'd been married since 1887, 58 years by the time Frank died. They'd built Goodyear together, lost it together, rebuilt with Seiberling together, raised 6 children together. Gertrude died in 1946 at age 82. Frank was 87 and suddenly alone in the 65-room house they'd shared for over 30 years. He lived another 9 years, declining health, fading memory, cared for by family and remaining staff, still living at Stan Hywet but increasingly unable to manage or enjoy it. He died on August 11, 1955, at age 95. He'd lived at Stan Hywet for exactly 40 years, from 1915 to 1955, longer than he'd run Goodyear, longer than he'd run Seiberling. Stan Hywet was the constant in a life defined by building, losing, and rebuilding. But his death created a crisis for the family. What do you do with a 65-room Tudor manor house and 70 acres when the patriarch who built it is gone? The children, now in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, faced a decision. Keep Stan Hywet private? That would require enormous ongoing costs. None of them had Frank's wealth. The operating expenses alone were tens of thousands annually. Sell it? To whom? Who would buy a 65-room Tudor manor in Akron, Ohio? It wasn't practical as a private residence for anyone who wasn't extraordinarily wealthy. Demolish it and sell the land? That was the practical choice. 70 acres in a growing city had significant value, but it meant destroying what their parents had built. Or donate it? In 1957, 2 years after Frank's death, the Seiberling children made their decision. They donated Stan Hywet Hall to a newly formed nonprofit foundation, the Stan Hywet Hall Foundation. The foundation would preserve the estate, open it to the public, and maintain it as a museum and garden. The family retained some involvement, foundation board seats, advisory roles, but ownership and responsibility passed to the nonprofit. Stan Hywet opened to public tours in 1957. Visitors could walk through the Great Hall, admire the music room, tour the gardens. Admission fees would help cover operating costs, supplemented by donations and grants. The transition fulfilled the motto Frank had carved above the door 42 years earlier, non nobis solum, not for us alone. Whether Frank intended it this way is unclear. When he chose that motto in 1915, he probably imagined Stan Hywet remaining in family hands while serving community purposes, hosting events, supporting culture, demonstrating civic pride. He probably didn't imagine his children would be forced to donate it because they couldn't afford to keep it private. But the result was the same. Stan Hywet became public, and in becoming public, it survived. If the family had tried to keep it private, Stan Hywet would likely have been sold and demolished by the 1970s. The operating costs were unsustainable for any individual family. The property taxes alone would have forced a sale. Instead, as a non-profit museum and garden, Stan Hywet has thrived. Over 150,000 visitors tour it annually. It hosts weddings and corporate events. The gardens are maintained by professional horticulturalists and volunteers. The manor house has been meticulously restored to its 1915 appearance. It's been designated a National Historic Landmark, protected from demolition or inappropriate development, recognized as one of America's finest examples of Tudor Revival architecture and one of the best preserved early 20th century estates. Stan Hywet survived because it stopped being private, because the Seiberling family let go of exclusive ownership and shared it with everyone. That was painful. Giving up your family home, the place where you grew up, where your parents lived for 40 years, isn't easy, but it was necessary. And it honored Frank's philosophy, whether he'd intended it or not. He believed wealth should serve the community, that success carried responsibility beyond personal comfort, that what you build should benefit others, not just yourself. Non nobis solum turned out to be prophetic. Stan Hywet exists today because it became exactly what the motto declared, not for the Seiberlings alone, but for everyone.
Let's return to 1921, because that year defines everything that came after. Frank was 62. He'd spent 23 years building Goodyear from a borrowed $3,500 to the world's largest tire manufacturer, and in a single board vote, he lost it all. Imagine standing in Stan Hywet's Great Hall in August 1921. You've just been forced out of the company you founded. Your personal wealth is tied up in stock you no longer control. You're 62, an age when rebuilding seems impossible. And you're surrounded by 65 rooms you built to celebrate a success that just ended. What do you feel? Rage? Despair? Determination? Frank apparently felt all three. Rage at the bankers who'd forced him out, despair at losing everything he'd built, determination to prove them wrong by starting over. Stan Hywet must have felt different after 1921. Before, it was a victory monument. After, it was a reminder of loss. Every room, every garden, every detail had been built with Goodyear profits, and Goodyear was gone. But Frank couldn't sell Stan Hywet. Even if he'd wanted to, and he didn't, who would buy it? The 1921 recession made selling a 65-room manor impossible, and his family lived there. Gertrude, the children. It was home. So he kept it, and he lived in it while rebuilding. Every morning, leaving Stan Hywet to work at the new Seiberling Rubber Company. Every night, returning to the palace built by the old company. The juxtaposition must have been constant. Success and failure, past and present, what he'd built and what he'd lost. Did Stan Hywet motivate him? A reminder that he could build great things so he could build again? Or did it haunt him? A monument to the empire he'd lost, mocking every small victory at Seiberling with memories of Goodyear's scale? Probably both, because that's how monuments work. They don't have single meanings. They reflect whatever you bring to them. In 1915, Stan Hywet meant triumph. In 1921, it meant loss. By 1927, when Seiberling Rubber had climbed to 7th in the nation, it meant resilience. In Frank's final years, it meant legacy, something that would outlast him, for better or worse. The house didn't change. Frank's relationship to it did. And that's maybe the real story of Stan Hywet. Not the architecture or gardens. Those are beautiful, but ultimately just objects. The real story is how a building's meaning shifts with the life lived inside it. How the same rooms can feel like victory and defeat, pride and burden, home and monument. Frank lived at Stan Hywet for 40 years. It saw him at his highest peak and lowest valley. It witnessed his comeback and his decline. It absorbed his entire adult life from 60 to 95. And then, 2 years after he died, it became public property. The private monument became a shared treasure. That transformation from Frank's home to everyone's heritage is maybe what non nobis solum
always meant. The gardens at Stan Hywet deserve their own attention because they reveal Frank's philosophy in ways the house doesn't. Warren Manning designed 70 acres of gardens, each with distinct character and purpose. This wasn't just decoration, it was a statement about the relationship between wealth, nature, and community. The English garden, formal beds, geometric patterns, topiaries, fountain. Classical design meant to evoke European estates and connect the Seiberlings to a tradition of landed gentry. But adapted for Ohio, using native plants where possible, designed for American climate. The Japanese garden, stone lanterns, maples, bamboo, water features. Popular in the 1910s among wealthy Americans interested in Eastern aesthetics, but also functional, a contemplative space, quieter and less formal than the English garden. The Birch Tree Alley, a long path lined with birch trees leading to the lagoon, a transitional space between the formal gardens near the house and the naturalistic landscaping further out. Walking meditation, movement through environments. The lagoon, man-made but designed to look natural, used for swimming, boating, ice skating, recreation but also beauty, the water reflecting sky and trees, changing with seasons. The dell, a naturalistic woodland garden, native plants, wildflowers, informal paths, designed to feel like discovered wilderness, even though every plant was deliberately chosen and placed. Manning's philosophy was that great estates should include diverse landscapes, that gardens should educate visitors about different design traditions and ecological systems, that beauty should serve purposes beyond display, recreation, contemplation, connection to nature. Frank approved all of this, funded it, maintained it. The gardens cost hundreds of thousands to establish and required constant care. Why? A 65-room house is understandable. You need space for family, guests, servants. But 70 acres of gardens? Because Frank believed wealth should create public good. The gardens weren't just for family enjoyment. They were meant to be seen, admired, studied. They demonstrated that Akron, an industrial city known for rubber factories, could produce beauty and culture. After Stan Hywet became public in 1957, the gardens proved their worth. They're now one of the estate's main attractions. Visitors spend hours walking the paths, photographing flowers, sitting by the lagoon. Garden clubs study Manning's designs. Horticulture students learn from the plant collections. The gardens have served exactly the purpose Frank envisioned in 1915: shared beauty, public education, community pride. But they've also required enormous resources to maintain: professional gardeners, volunteers, grants, and donations. The Stan Hywet Foundation spends hundreds of thousands annually just on garden maintenance. If Stan Hywet had remained private, the gardens would have declined. No family could afford the upkeep. By becoming public, the gardens not only survived, but thrived, better maintained now than at any point since Manning's original design. Non nobis solum applies to the gardens as much as the house. They were never meant to be private, and they've fulfilled their purpose only by being shared.
There's a photograph of Frank from the 1940s, late in his life. He's in his 80s, sitting in the library at Stan Hywet, surrounded by books, looking directly at the camera with an expression that's hard to read. Not smiling, men of his generation rarely smiled in photographs, but not stern either, just present. What was he thinking in that moment, at 80-something, decades removed from Goodyear's loss, years into comfortable retirement at Seiberling, living in the house he'd built 30 years earlier? Was he satisfied? He'd built 2 major companies, raised 6 children, lived in a palace, survived losing everything, and rebuilt. By most measures, an extraordinarily successful life. Or was he haunted? Did he still think about Goodyear? About the company that should have been his legacy but was taken by bankers? About the what-ifs?
What if the recession hadn't hit? What if he'd accepted the banker's terms? What if he'd stayed as chairman instead of walking out? We can't know. Frank left business records and some correspondence, but not introspective writings about his inner life. What we do know is he lived at Stan Hywet for 40 years. That's longer than most people live anywhere, longer than he ran any single company. Stan Hywet was the constant, while everything else, businesses, wealth, status, shifted. And 2 years after he died, his children gave it away. Not sold, donated, to a nonprofit that would preserve it and share it with the public. That donation suggests the children understood something Frank had expressed in the motto, non nobis solum. The house was never meant to be hoarded. It was meant to serve purposes beyond family comfort. Whether they made that choice out of financial necessity or philosophical conviction doesn't really matter. The result was the same. Stan Hywet survived by becoming public. And Frank's legacy, what he's remembered for, shifted. Not primarily as the founder of Goodyear or Seiberling, but as the builder of Stan Hywet, as the industrialist who created something beautiful and allowed it to be shared. That's probably not the legacy he imagined in 1915 when he moved into the completed manor, but it's the one that endured.
The 1921 ouster from Goodyear was both disaster and liberation for Frank. Disaster because he lost everything he'd built. 23 years of work gone in a board vote. His wealth evaporated. His identity as Goodyear's founder and president ended. At 62, he faced starting over from essentially nothing. But also liberation, because at Goodyear, Frank had been constrained by boards, by shareholders, by bankers, by the expectations and structures of running one of America's largest companies. At Seiberling Rubber, he was free. He owned it. He controlled it. He could run it according to his principles without answering to anyone. And Seiberling succeeded partly because Frank could be more flexible, more experimental, more willing to take risks than he could have been at Goodyear. The company rose from 330th to 7th in 6 years, an extraordinary trajectory, faster than Goodyear had grown even in its best years. Part of that was Frank's experience and reputation. Part was luck and timing. But part was also that Frank, freed from corporate bureaucracy, could move fast and make decisions without committee approval. Losing Goodyear forced Frank to discover whether he could still build, whether the success at Goodyear was replicable or had been a one-time combination of timing and luck. He proved it was replicable, that at 62 he could start fresh and build another major company, that the skills and knowledge that built Goodyear could build Seiberling. That's a different kind of success than maintaining Goodyear would have been. Maintaining is conservative, protecting what exists. Building is creative, proving you can do it again. Frank lived at Stan Hywet during both phases. The house witnessed his highest triumphs and lowest defeats. It absorbed 40 years of a life lived at extremes. And when he died, the house remained, outlasted him, outlasted Goodyear and Seiberling both, outlasted the fortune that built it. Because buildings are more permanent than businesses or wealth or reputation. Buildings just stand there, requiring only maintenance to endure. Stan Hywet's survival wasn't guaranteed. It required the family donating it, the foundation preserving it, visitors supporting it, grants funding it. But the raw fact of the building, 64,000 square feet of stone and timber and slate, that was permanent from the moment construction finished in 1915. Frank built something that outlasted everything else he created, whether he intended that or not.
The motto, non nobis solum, appears multiple times at Stan Hywet. Above the main entrance, carved in stone, on decorative elements throughout the house, in the gardens. Frank wanted it omnipresent, a constant reminder of the philosophy behind the estate. But what did he actually mean by it? The literal translation, not for us alone. But alone what? Not for us alone, but for whom? The community? Posterity? God? Frank never explicitly explained, but his actions suggest he meant it practically. Stan Hywet should serve purposes beyond family comfort. He hosted community events, fundraisers for local charities, cultural gatherings. He opened the gardens to groups studying horticulture. He used Stan Hywet's grandeur to elevate Akron's cultural standing. In that sense, he was living the motto before the estate became public. Stan Hywet wasn't hoarded, it was shared, at least selectively. But there's another interpretation. Not for us alone could also mean this won't remain ours. That Frank understood, perhaps instinctively, that grand estates rarely survive multiple generations in family hands. That eventually, one way or another, they become public or disappear. If that's what he meant, then the motto was prophetic. Stan Hywet survived precisely by not remaining the Seiberlings alone. The 1957 donation wasn't betrayal of Frank's vision, it was fulfillment of it. Compare Stan Hywet to estates that families tried to keep private. Most were demolished or subdivided. The operating costs, property taxes, and maintenance requirements overwhelmed descendants who didn't have the founder's wealth. Stan Hywet avoided that fate because the Seiberlings let go. They understood, consciously or not, that preserving their parents' creation required giving up ownership. Non nobis solum made that easier. The motto gave philosophical justification for what was also practical necessity. We're not abandoning our family home, we're fulfilling our father's vision that it serve the community. Whether Frank foresaw that specific outcome doesn't matter. He created the framework, philosophical and architectural, that allowed Stan Hywet to survive. That's maybe the most important thing he built. Not the 65 rooms, not the gardens, but the idea embedded in the motto. Great things survive only by being shared.
Stan Hywet today is remarkably well preserved. The Stan Hywet Hall Foundation has invested millions in restoration and maintenance since 1957. The manor house has been returned to its 1915 appearance. Original furnishings located or reproduced, architectural details restored. Modern systems, HVAC, electrical, plumbing, updated to preserve the building while maintaining historical integrity. The gardens have been even more extensively restored. Warren Manning's original plans were studied, period photographs consulted, plant lists researched. The gardens today are closer to Manning's vision than they've been in decades, possibly better maintained than when the Seiberlings lived there and had to manage costs. Visitor numbers have grown steadily, from a few thousand in the late 1950s to over 150,000 annually by the 2020s. People come for the architecture, for the gardens, for tours, for weddings and events held on the grounds, for the AA birthplace site in the Gate Lodge. The foundation has expanded programming, educational tours for schools, horticulture workshops, summer concerts, holiday events. Stan Hywet has become an integral part of Akron's cultural infrastructure, exactly what Frank envisioned in 1915. But preservation is expensive. The foundation spends hundreds of thousands annually just on maintenance, roof repairs, masonry work, garden upkeep, climate control to protect furnishings, security systems, insurance. Revenue comes from multiple sources: admission fees, event rentals, donations, grants, endowment income. It's a constant financial balance. Some years are strong, others challenging. The foundation has occasionally faced financial crises, moments when it seemed Stan Hywet might have to close or significantly reduce operations. But each time, the community has rallied. Fundraising campaigns, increased attendance, grants from foundations and government agencies. Stan Hywet survives because enough people value it, because visitors keep coming, because donors keep giving, because volunteers keep maintaining the gardens and house. It's a democratic form of preservation. The Seiberlings built it, but the public sustains it. Frank's motto, "Not for us alone," describes not just his philosophy, but the reality of how Stan Hywet continues to exist. If people stopped caring, stopped visiting, stopped supporting, Stan Hywet would decline and eventually close. But they haven't, and the estate thrives. That's very different from how the Breakers survives through the Preservation Society's institutional power, or how Casa Loma survives through commercial tourism operation. Stan Hywet survives through genuine community investment, people who believe it's worth preserving and put money and time toward that goal. Frank built it. The community preserved it. Both were necessary.
There's an irony in how Frank's two companies, Goodyear and Seiberling, are remembered versus how Stan Hywet is remembered. Goodyear still exists. It's still one of the world's largest tire manufacturers. The Goodyear blimp is an American icon. The name is known worldwide. But Frank's connection to Goodyear is mostly forgotten. Most people don't know he founded it. They might recognize the name Goodyear, but they associate it with the company, not the man. Seiberling Rubber no longer exists as an independent company. It was absorbed by Firestone in 1964, and even the brand name disappeared eventually. Frank's second company vanished within a decade of his death. Stan Hywet endures, and Frank's name is inseparably connected to it. Everyone who visits learns about Frank and Gertrude Seiberling. Tour guides tell their story. Exhibits explain their lives. Frank's legacy is preserved because the house is preserved. He probably wouldn't have predicted that. In 1915, he likely thought his business achievements would be his primary legacy, that Goodyear would remain the Seiberling family company, growing for generations, that Stan Hywet would be a nice family home but secondary to his industrial accomplishments. Instead, Goodyear erased his name, Seiberling disappeared, and Stan Hywet became his monument. Part of that is because buildings last longer than businesses. Companies get bought, merged, dissolved. Buildings just sit there, requiring only maintenance to endure. But part of it is also because Stan Hywet represents something beyond business success. It represents a philosophy, not for us alone, that resonates more deeply than profit margins and market share. Frank built companies to make money and create jobs and produce useful products, important goals, but not emotionally resonant. He built Stan Hywet to create beauty and demonstrate civic pride and house his family and serve his community. Those are emotionally resonant goals. They touch something deeper than economics. So Stan Hywet endures in memory and reality while the companies fade. That's probably not the legacy Frank imagined, but it's the one he got. And maybe it's better, because Stan Hywet, open to the public, touched by visitors who will never know Frank personally, serves more people now than Goodyear or Seiberling ever did. Not for us alone proved to be the most important thing Frank ever said or built. Let's imagine Frank's last days at Stan Hywet in August 1955. He was 95. Gertrude had died 9 years earlier. He was alone in the 65-room house, cared for by family and staff. Did he walk the gardens? Probably not by then. Age and health would have confined him mostly to the house. Did he sit in the great hall, looking up at the oak beams he'd commissioned 40 years earlier? Maybe, if he was still mobile enough. Did he think about what would happen to Stan Hywet after he died? Almost certainly. He must have known his children couldn't afford to keep it private. Did he hope they'd donate it? Did he want Stan Hywet to become public, living up to the motto he'd carved above the door? We don't know. No record exists of Frank's final wishes for the estate beyond standard inheritance provisions. But the children donated it 2 years later, quickly enough that it suggests they'd discussed it, perhaps with Frank before his death, certainly among themselves after. They could have sold it, could have demolished it and subdivided the land. Those options would have been financially practical. They chose donation, chose to honor the motto, not for us alone, by making Stan Hywet literally not theirs alone. That choice saved the estate, and it honored Frank's philosophy, whether or not he'd explicitly requested it. Frank died having built 2 major companies, raised 6 children, lived in a palace for 40 years, lost everything and rebuilt, seen extraordinary success and devastating failure. And his monument, the thing that outlasted everything else, was a house he'd built in 1915 and a motto he'd carved above its door. Buildings outlast businesses. Philosophy outlasts profit. And sometimes, the things we build as side projects or secondary concerns become our primary legacy. Stan Hywet wasn't Frank's most important achievement by his own standards, but it became his most enduring one by everyone else's. The Gate Lodge and the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous add another layer to Stan Hywet's legacy. On May 12, 1935, Henrietta Seiberling, married to Frank's son John, arranged a meeting between Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith in the Gate Lodge. Bill was a New York stockbroker struggling with alcoholism. Dr. Bob was an Akron surgeon with the same struggle. Henrietta knew both men and believed they could help each other. They talked for hours about their addiction, about their failed attempts to quit, about their belief that recovery required spiritual transformation alongside practical support. That conversation became the foundation of Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill and Dr. Bob became co-founders. The principles they discussed, mutual support, spiritual growth, the 12 steps, became AA's core philosophy. Today, millions of people have participated in AA worldwide. The organization has helped countless individuals recover from addiction. And it began in a building on Frank Seiberling's estate. Frank had nothing directly to do with AA's founding. He wasn't involved in that 1935 meeting, but he created the environment where it happened. The estate, the Gate Lodge, the family culture that valued helping others. Non nobis solum, not for us alone, applies to AA's founding too. The estate served a purpose beyond family comfort. It became the birthplace of a movement that has served humanity far beyond anything Frank explicitly intended. AA members visit Stan Hywet specifically to see the Gate Lodge. Plaques mark the location. The foundation acknowledges AA's connection to the estate's history. It's become part of Stan Hywet's identity, not just a beautiful estate, but a place where important things happened, where beauty served purpose, where private wealth facilitated public good. That's exactly what Not For Us Alone meant. Stan Hywet wasn't built to be hoarded. It was built to serve. And it did serve in ways Frank couldn't have predicted. As AA's birthplace, as a public garden and museum, as an educational resource, as a community gathering space. All of that happened because Frank built something larger than he needed, because he embraced the idea that wealth carries responsibility, because he carved Not For Us Alone above his door and meant it.
The economics of preserving Stan Hywet reveal the challenge of maintaining Gilded Age estates in the modern era. Annual operating costs, approximately $600,000 to $800,000 currently, includes staff salaries, gardeners, tour guides, administrators, maintenance workers, utilities, heating, cooling, electricity for a 64,000 square foot building, maintenance, roof repairs, masonry work, painting, plumbing, electrical, garden upkeep, plants, mulch, equipment, seasonal plantings, insurance, property, liability, valuable collections, property taxes, reduced due to nonprofit status but still significant, security systems and monitoring, conservation and restoration projects, revenue sources, admission fees, roughly 40 to 50% of budget, event rentals, weddings, corporate events, 20 to 30%, donations, individual and corporate, 15 to 25%, grants, foundations and government agencies, 10 to 15%, endowment income, 10 to 15%, gift shop and other auxiliary revenue, 5 to 10%. The balance is precarious. In strong years, revenue exceeds expenses and the surplus goes into reserves or capital projects. In weak years, recessions, pandemics, declining tourism, the foundation draws on reserves or launches emergency fundraising. Compare this to private ownership. If the Seiberlings had tried to maintain Stan Hywet privately after Frank's death, operating costs, same $600,000 to $800,000 annually, revenue, zero, no admission fees, event rentals, or donations for private use. Result, the family would need to spend hundreds of thousands per year from personal wealth just to keep the estate operating. No single family member or even the combined family could sustain that. Within a decade, maybe two, financial pressure would have forced a sale or demolition. The nonprofit model works because costs are distributed across thousands of visitors, hundreds of donors, and multiple grant sources. No single person bears the full burden. That's another interpretation of Not For Us Alone, not just philosophical, but practical. Stan Hywet survives because the cost is shared, because many people contribute small amounts rather than one family paying everything. Democratic preservation, collective responsibility, exactly what Frank's motto suggested. The Seiberlings built it, but everyone who visits, donates, or volunteers owns a piece of its continuation. That's how great estates survive in an era when individual wealth rarely matches Gilded Age levels.
Walk through Stan Hywet today and try to feel what Frank felt building it in 1915. Pride, certainly. This was his achievement, his vision realized in stone and timber. The grandest private residence in Ohio, proof that he'd succeeded. But also responsibility? Burden? Did Frank ever stand in the Great Hall and feel the weight of what he'd built? The operating costs? The staff to employ? The maintenance required? The expectation that it be preserved for future generations? Creating something grand means committing to sustaining it. And sustaining costs money, time, attention, forever. Frank lived at Stan Hywet for 40 years. That's a long time to maintain a 65-room house and 70-acre garden. Even with wealth and staff, it's a constant commitment. Did he ever regret building it so large? Did he ever wish for something simpler? Probably not. Frank wasn't a man who did things halfway. He built Stan Hywet exactly the way he wanted it. If he'd wanted smaller, he would have built smaller. But he must have understood, especially after losing Goodyear in 1921, how precarious it all was. How dependent Stan Hywet's survival was on his ability to keep earning. How a change in fortune could threaten everything. And in fact, a change in fortune did threaten everything. The 1921 ouster put Stan Hywet at risk. If Frank hadn't been able to build Seiberling rubber, if the comeback had failed, he might have lost Stan Hywet too. He didn't. He rebuilt his fortune enough to keep the estate, but it was close. That proximity to loss probably changed how he viewed Stan Hywet. Before 1921, it was a victory monument. After, it was a survivor, something he'd managed to keep despite catastrophe. And after Frank died, the estate survived only by transforming, by becoming public, by abandoning the model of private ownership that created it. That transformation would probably have saddened Frank. He built Stan Hywet to be his family's home. He wanted his children and grandchildren to live there, to inherit not just property, but a way of life. But he also carved "not for us alone" above the door. He knew, or at least intuited, that great things must be shared to endure. So maybe he would have understood. Maybe he would have approved of the donation. Maybe he would have been proud that Stan Hywet serves thousands of visitors annually rather than one family. Or maybe he would have been heartbroken. We can't know. What we do know is the estate stands, beautiful, preserved, accessible. Exactly as the motto promised, not for the Seiberlings alone, but for everyone. Stan Hywet Hall stands today at 714 North Portage Path in Akron, Ohio. 70 acres of gardens and grounds, 65 rooms across 64,000 square feet, 150,000 visitors annually, a National Historic Landmark, one of America's finest examples of Tudor Revival architecture and Gilded Age estate design, and a monument to a man who built, lost, and rebuilt, who carved a motto above his door that became more prophetic than he probably imagined. Frank Seiberling founded Goodyear in 1898 with 3,500 borrowed dollars, built it into the world's largest tire manufacturer, then lost it in 1921 to bankers and a recession he couldn't control. He built Stan Hywet between 1912 and 1915 at the peak of his success, commissioned the finest architects and designers, created 70 acres of gardens that would be studied for generations, chose a motto, "not for us alone," that reflected his philosophy of wealth and responsibility. He lived at Stan Hywet for 40 years, through triumph and disaster, through the loss of Goodyear and the building of Seiberling, through Gertrude's death and his own long decline. And 2 years after he died, his children donated the estate to a nonprofit foundation because they couldn't afford to keep it private, because maintaining 65 rooms and 70 acres exceeded any individual family's capacity. The donation fulfilled Frank's motto. Stan Hywet became literally not for the Seiberlings alone. It became public, Shared, a cultural resource rather than a private treasure. And in becoming public, it survived, thrived even, better preserved now than at any point since Frank's death, better maintained, better funded, better understood. If the family had tried to keep it private, Stan Hywet would likely have been demolished by the 1970s or 1980s. The operating costs and property taxes would have forced a sale, and no private buyer would have maintained it. They'd have subdivided the land and torn down the house. Public ownership saved it. Not government ownership. Stan Hywet has always been privately owned by a non-profit foundation, but public in the sense that anyone can visit, that it serves community purposes, that its survival depends on collective support rather than individual wealth. That's the only model that works for estates of this scale in the modern era. The Vanderbilts at the Breakers learned that. The Seiberlings at Stan Hywet learned that. Every family that built a Gilded Age palace learned it eventually. You can build something grand, but you can't keep it private forever. Share it or lose it. Those are the only options.
Frank chose his motto wisely. Not for us alone was both philosophy and prediction. He believed wealth should serve the community, and he created an estate that could only survive by doing exactly that. The businesses Frank built are mostly gone. Goodyear exists but bears no trace of his connection to it. Seiberling rubber disappeared entirely. The fortunes he accumulated were divided and spent and diminished. What remains is Stan Hywet, and Frank's name permanently attached to it. Every visitor learns about Frank and Gertrude Seiberling. Every tour guide tells their story. The legacy is preserved because the building is preserved. He probably wouldn't have predicted that in 1915. Standing in the newly completed Great Hall, 65 rooms surrounding him, Goodyear thriving, the future bright. He probably thought his business achievements would define his legacy. Instead, a house and a motto did. Buildings last longer than businesses. Philosophy endures beyond profit. And sometimes the things we build as expressions of success become monuments to something deeper. The idea that great things survive only by being shared. Non nobis solum, not for us alone. Frank carved those words in stone above his door in 1915. And they've proven true in ways he couldn't have fully understood. Stan Hywet exists today because it stopped being the Seiberlings alone. Because the family let go of exclusive ownership. Because thousands of visitors support it annually. Because volunteers maintain the gardens. Because donors fund restoration projects. Because the community believes it's worth preserving. Frank built it, but everyone else keeps it standing. That's not failure. That's exactly what the motto promised. The house endures. The gardens flourish. Visitors walk the same paths Frank walked, sit in the same great hall, admire the same architecture. And above the entrance, carved in stone, permanent and prophetic, non nobis solum, not for us alone. Never was, never could be. A palace built for one family survives because it serves everyone. Frank's monument stands, not to his wealth or his companies or his business achievements, but to the idea he carved in stone, that what we build should outlast us by serving others. The motto fulfilled itself. Stan Hywet became exactly what it declared it should be. Not for the Seiberlings alone, for everyone who walks through its doors, wanders its gardens, and learns what it means to build something meant to be shared.